Hello, and welcome to Wholesome Monday, where we are currently doing a deep dive into Nancy's Mysterious Letter, the eighth book in the Nancy Drew Mystery series. If you have been around for a little while now, you know we have previously read chapters 1, 2, and 3, and then had a bit of a discussion about what happens in the chapter, what works, what doesn't. If you don't have time to watch the video, you can also follow along on Spotify. I will have the link down below in the description box. In case you don't remember, in chapter 3, Nancy went after the thief in her car and she got stuck on the bridge, and we left off right at the point where she heard a cracking sound. So let's just hop right into chapter 4 and find out what happens. Chapter 4, Doubtful Inheritance. In a flash, Nancy shifted to reverse. The convertible shot backward just in time to keep it from breaking through the bridge. "Oh," she said aloud. Shaken by her experience, Nancy pulled to the side of the road and parked. When her heart stopped pounding, she began to think once more about Edward Nixon. "I wonder where he went," she thought. Nancy turned around and went back to River Heights. She stopped at police headquarters and asked to see Chief McGinnis. The desk sergeant buzzed his superior's office, and after a short conversation to announce Nancy, told her to go into the man's private office. He smiled at her. "More clues?" he asked. "Yes, one. I don't know how good it is." She told him about having spotted Edgar Nixon's car. While she was not sure he was the person driving it, Nancy felt it was worthwhile to follow up the lead. "The road had no signs, but it's the one with the old bridge. He got across, but I almost crashed through into the water." The chief frowned. "Nancy, you must be more careful." She asked him whether he had any news for her. He shook his head. "Not a single clue to that man's whereabouts," McGinnis said. "But I'll put some men on this new clue right away. Thanks for coming in, Nancy." Before returning home, she decided to stop at the hospital and visit Ira Nixon. When Nancy arrived at his room, she was surprised to find a strange man in it. "You looking for the mail carrier?" he asked. "Yes." "He's gone home. After the doctor saw him this morning, he said Ira could go. Nice old fella. I hope he gets along all right." Nancy hoped so too. She looked at her watch. "I'll go to see him at his home after lunch," she told the patient. By 2 o'clock she was at Ira Nixon's house, carrying a jar of Mrs. Gruen's homemade stew. When she rang, she called, "Come in." Nancy found him reclining on a couch in his tiny living room. He looked much better than he had on Sunday. "Hannah Gruen sent you this stew," Nancy said. She smiled. "I can tell you it's delicious." "The housekeeper of yours is a fine, kind woman," Ira Nixon said, "and she is one of a few people a man likes to confide in." Nancy did not want to upset the mail carrier, so she refrained from mentioning Edgar, but Ira brought up the subject himself. "Would you like to see a picture of Edgar?" "Oh, yes," Nancy replied. He brought it from a desk drawer, and Nancy gazed at the photograph. As Ira had said, Edgar was handsome, but his eyes were as cold as steel, and she instantly felt that he was not a person who could be trusted. She refrained from saying anything except that he was an attractive-looking man. Ira Nixon smiled. The girls always liked him, and he liked them, but he never got married. "May I borrow this photograph?" Nancy asked. The mail carrier misunderstood her request. He remarked with a grin, "So you like him too, same as the rest of the ladies." Nancy did not comment. He must not know right now she wanted the picture for identification. She rose and said she must go. "I'll put this stew in your refrigerator," Nancy said. "Thank you. I'll have some for my dinner, and please thank Mrs. Gruen." Nancy slipped the photograph into her purse, then carried the jar of stew to the kitchen. Driving home, she wondered just how she might use Edgar's photograph to get more information about him. Nancy decided first to find Tommy and went to his house. Without telling her suspicions, she held up the photograph for him to look at. Instantly, he said, "He's the man in the yellow coat." Nancy was thrilled. This seemed to identify Edgar Nixon positively as the thief who had stolen his half-brother's mail. But before reporting this to the postal inspector, Nancy decided to investigate the gas stations in River Heights and on the outskirts for further proof. She drove from one to another, but none of the attendants remembered ever having seen the man in the photograph. "Guess he buys his gas somewhere else," most of them remarked. Nancy was becoming discouraged. She was about to give up when she recalled having once stopped at a small place on the outskirts of River Heights. The station was on the road leading to Emerson, where Ned's college was located. She turned the car in that direction and a few minutes later pulled up to the pump. A pleasant young man came to help her. 5 gallons, please," Nancy said. When the attendant finished putting it in, she paid him, then pulled out the photograph of Edgar Nixon. "Has this man ever stopped here for gas?" she asked. The attendant studied the picture a few moments. "Yes, he's been in several times. For a moment I didn't recognize him. When he comes here, he's always wearing a hat and overcoat." "Are they camel's hair?" Nancy asked quickly. "That's the man." Nancy inquired if the attendant knew his name and where he lived. "No, he's not the talkative type. Somehow I got the idea, though, that he lives in some distant town but comes to River Heights quite often. He never says why." "How recently has he been here?" The man's answer startled Nancy. "Come to think of it, he stopped yesterday." "I suppose you're trying to find him. Maybe this will help you. He made a phone call from that booth over there, and as I went by, I heard him say Miss Drew." "Is that all you heard?" Nancy asked, astounded. "That's all." The attendant turned away to serve an arriving customer. Nancy drove off, wondering whether Edgar Nixon could have been talking about her. As Nancy let herself into the Drew house about 20 minutes later, she was just in time to answer the telephone. Her father was calling. "Nancy, I'd like you to come down here immediately. I have something amazing to show you." "I'll be there right away." She dashed back outside and turned her convertible in the direction of her father's office. After saying hello to his secretary, Miss Hanson, Nancy went directly into Mr. Drew's private office. He handed her a letter saying, "What do you think of this new mystery?" Nancy sat down in a big chair and started to read. Her eyes grew larger and larger. The letter was from London on the stationery of Malmesbury and Bates Jones. It read, "My dear Miss Drew, this is to inform you it is possible an inheritance has been left to you. We are the legal representatives of the estate of Jonathan Smith, late of Little Cottingham, Midhampton, Berks, who died in estate on May 2nd last. Mr. Smith had as only kin a sister from whom he was estranged, Mrs. Genevieve Smith Drew. We find she predeceased Mr. Smith by 5 years, leaving a daughter who is Mr. Smith's sole heir by law. We have learned that the daughter, Miss Nancy Smith Drew, is in the United States, where our agents have been trying to trace her. You are the only Miss Nancy Drew so far discovered by them, and we beg of you to communicate with us. If you happen to be the Miss Drew for whom we are searching, will you be so good as to submit proofs of your identity, whereupon we shall be happy to make arrangements for your return to England to claim the inheritance. Sincerely, A.E. Lionel Bates Jones." When Nancy finished reading the letter, she looked at her father, who had been watching her closely. He smiled. "You were almost an heiress," the lawyer said with a chuckle. Nancy sighed. "How I wish I was the right Nancy Drew." Her father's eyes twinkled. "Then you wouldn't have the fun of a mystery to solve," he said. "You're right," she agreed. "May I use one of your phones and start trying to find Nancy Smith Drew?" Go ahead. In the meantime, I'll make an overseas call to this law firm and tell them the facts. Nancy waited while he gave the number, but the lawyer was told that the Atlantic lines would be tied up for several hours. He turned to Nancy. Maybe you'll have this case solved before I can put through the phone call, he teased. His daughter laughed. I wish it was that easy. Nancy phoned the police department and the post office. Nancy Smith Drew was not known at either place. Directories and telephone books gave no clue. Nancy said goodbye to her father and drove home. Bess and George were there and were eager to hear the latest news. When Nancy gave them all the facts, the cousins gasped. George remarked, Things are certainly breaking fast. Now you have 2 mysteries on your hands. Well, tell us what we can do to help. Right now, I don't have any idea in my head, Nancy confessed, but I'll let you know. She invited the girls to stay to dinner, and they accepted at once. Mr. Drew had already told Hannah Gruen he would not be home until later, so the 4 of them ate without him. They had just finished dessert when the doorbell rang. I'll get it, said Nancy. When she opened the door, a strange woman angrily forced her way inside and stepped toward the living room. The caller was poorly dressed in a worn-looking coat. Its collar was pulled up to her stringy, bleached hair. You're Nancy Drew, ain't you? When the girl nodded, the woman added, You're the one I'm looking for. With that, her fist shot out and she tried to hit Nancy. Oh, and that's the end of the chapter. God damn. Well. How to write effective chapter enders to get your audience to immediately start the next chapter and then get caught up in that chapter and immediately start the next chapter and so on and so forth. Just literally end every chapter on a cliffhanger. Interesting choice. As a child, I feel like this definitely worked on me because I would pick up a Nancy Drew book and not be able to put it down. I would just have to keep reading until I got to the end of the book. And before you knew it, it was the middle of the night and I had to go to school tomorrow. And I had to go to school the next morning. Wow, I can't talk today. Here is a great question. Is overusing cliffhangers at the end of each chapter effective? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I personally feel like it takes away from the effectiveness of an actual cliffhanger. Because I now know that every chapter is going to end in a cliffhanger, and every time it is going to work out fine. I mean, despite the fact that Nancy Drew books are children's books, and they are obviously not going to end poorly. There's several, we know no harm comes to Nancy in the end. I do understand that the writers want to keep you going to the next chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter, but after a while, it does kind of feel like a cop-out, if that makes sense. Because there are more effective ways when you're writing a story to get that page turner feeling. There are more ways than just ending every chapter on a cliffhanger to get your reader to want to turn the page to the next chapter and keep reading each chapter. And I'm going to talk about some of them. For example, at the base, have an interesting plot. Have a story that your reader is interested in and wants to find out what happens in it. And honestly, you can see that in, sorry, I'm just looking at my bookshelf. You can see that in so many other books. If you have an interesting story that your character wants to find more about, if you have built a world that your reader wants to be immersed in, that in itself is going to add to the reader's need to turn the page to find out what happens. Likewise, if you have a character that your reader is invested in, that is also going to be a page turner. What's a good example of that? I'm going to use this example, Anna Dressed in Blood by Kendare Blake. I did read this book a while ago. I will admit that most of my book choices back in the day were chosen, like if it had a beautiful cover, I wanted to read it. This is not always true, but definitely added to the need to just want to own it just for the cover. I wonder, oh yeah, and then it's got the red letter writing down the spine. So beautiful. Let's get all these page sounds. So basically the main protagonist is from a long line of ghost hunters, I guess is what you could call them. They have, special magical devices, in this case, an athame. And he goes around following local legend and lore to find ghosts and kill them. Make them so they're not ghosts anymore. Until he meets Anna Dressed in Blood. And this book, I really liked the main character from the get-go. And part of that is because the way he narrates his story. It's written in first-person POV, so obviously you get the nice internal monologue and you get good characterization. The story itself is interesting and mysterious. So it's a young adult, of course, so would be very interesting to read as an adult. But the character of Anna is so, you immediately are curious about her. You want to know more about her. You want to know her backstory. You want to know why she is the way she is. And you're viewing all of this through the character of Cass. Cass is witty and funny in that very teenage, boyish sense. Editing Alley here. I just wanted to hop on and quickly give a little bit more context of what I mean when I say Cass is very a witty and funny narrator within the story. And I couldn't find all of the examples I wanted to, but I do have one for sure that I can pull from. And I'm just going to read it quickly to you here. Thomas's Aunt Rika lives in the middle of bumblefuck nowhere. We've been driving on unmarked dirt roads for at least 10 minutes. There are no signs of any kind, just trees and more trees, then a brief clearing leading up to more trees. If he hasn't been out here in years, I have no idea how he seems to be finding his way so easily. Are we lost? You'd admit it if we were lost, right? Thomas smiles, maybe a bit nervously. We're not lost. At least, not yet. Who the hell are they? Road construction squirrels? It doesn't even look like these things have been driven on in the last 10 years. That's a quote from Girl of Nightmares. I had another one that I was going to read. I was trying to find the whole context of it from Anna Dressed in Blood, and it's, "You look beautiful," I say, because it's the first thing that pops into my stupid, empty head. I consider using my athame to cut my tongue out. I wanted to find the context for that quote, but I went through the whole book as I skimmed through it, and I couldn't find the exact scene for context. I don't remember when that happened, but I remember it being funny at the time within the context, so I wrote it in my quote book. But that's just what I mean when you look at the way that he explains things, especially when he's talking about where Thomas's Aunt Rika lives, in the middle of bumblefuck nowhere, and road construction squirrels. He just has a very particular character voice that makes it interesting to read. It keeps me engaged as a reader. And that's all I wanted to add. And I couldn't put this book down. I picked it up and I just wanted to keep reading it and keep reading it and keep reading it because I wanted to know what happened. I wanted to know about Anna. I wanted her to have a happy ending. I mean, just look at these covers. Look at how beautiful that is. If you have a compelling character who is interesting, so I honestly don't have a lot of paranormal fiction books. This is one that I do have, I guess, because I enjoyed it so much. But if you have a character who is engaging, who is more real, who seems less like a character and more like a real person. This is not necessarily easy to do. It does take practice, and it does take you really need to break down what makes your character tick. It's very easy to create a character, one dimensional, their likes and dislikes, their kind of quirks. What's the best example I can use? I like my own character. She started off very one dimensional. She was just a young adult going to university, and then all of a sudden this supernatural paranormal stuff started happening to her that she had to deal with and couldn't ignore because it was right in her face. She was a passive protagonist. And that's one thing I quite like about the Nancy Drew books is she's an active protagonist in her own story. Cass is an active protagonist in his own story. Anna is an active protagonist in her own story within that book, even as not the main character. These are all things that add to your storytelling in the books that honestly can make your story a page turner without having to use these very gimmicky ways of getting your reader to turn the page. Like with that, her fist shot out and she tried to hit Nancy. The end. You're like, oh, I want to know what happens. But now, because every chapter has been like that, it's not weighty anymore. It's like clickbait. It's the book version of clickbait. Just the fact that it's like this makes me not want to click on it. Makes me not want to turn to the next page because I feel like I'm being manipulated into turning the page to find out what happens. And that is my opinion on having every chapter end in a cliffhanger, I guess. My little rant, my little mini rant. Going back to the beginning of the chapter, Nancy is not caught in the water. I feel like it would have been more interesting if she had fallen in the water, honestly. And I guess that's another thing is we know that Nancy, nothing really terrible is going to happen to her because she's the main character and there's 100 Nancy Drew books. So she's obviously not going to die. But what happens if she doesn't have things go in her favor every single time? And I know, because these are the revised versions that I have, I know the originals they were a bit longer, obviously had more just like racial undertone stuff and characters that did not age well. But in the revisions, they also revised Nancy to a more prim, proper, and perfect version of herself. And I know a lot of people who liked or who grew up on the original Nancy Drew books dislike that in the revisions she's this more perfect version of herself and prefer the imperfect Nancy, which is another thing that makes your character seem more real and less like a character. When I read this, Nancy is characterized very well. We know exactly who she is. We know exactly what kind of things she likes. We see her actively playing a part in her story. What we don't get are her flaws. What makes her human? What makes her just a regular girl out there trying to help people and solve mysteries? We don't have that in this. We just have this perfect caricature of what Nancy Drew is like. So going back to this, Nancy does not fall into the river. She goes back to the chief. I find it interesting that she goes and immediately is led into his private office. She is clearly a very important, obviously she's an important character in the story because she's the main character, but she is obviously clearly well regarded by the police chief if she's like, I have a clue, and the police chief is like, let me hear it right away, I want to know. Then you get this nice scene of where she checks up on Ira, brings him homemade stew from Hannah. So again, more of this kindness from her, but also a little bit conniving because she sees the photo and asks to borrow it and specifically doesn't tell him the reason why. And then she goes to find Tommy to see if what her deductions are accurate, basically, which she is right. She drives around to all of the different gas stations, which honestly is a pretty smart thing. And I know I've just finished ranting about how perfect Nancy seems, and it makes her more of a character than an actual real person feeling. But I do like how all of this stuff very much makes her an active participant in the story. And I find that some stories can be difficult to really get invested in, or it's hard to feel like sympathy towards a character when they are just being pushed around by the whims of the other characters and the plot. And I don't mean this necessarily in a super critical way. I do feel there is a place and a time for that, especially if you look at Carol S. Pearson's view on the sacrificial lamb as a character archetype. But I do find characters that are active participants in their story to be more engaging for the reader themselves when the character is their own character in the story and not a reader stand-in. So she gets all this information about Edward Nixon. She confirms that the person who she thinks stole the letters and all of that jazz was in fact Edgar Nixon. The person driving the car that she was following was Edgar Nixon. Everybody confirms that, yeah, that's the guy. This is what he looks like. And then we finally get to read the letter that got stolen for Miss Nancy Drew. You can see the writer here setting everything up. So we start off with this inheritance money with Ira and Edgar Nixon. And now we have this inheritance money to Nancy Smith Drew. The reader is very much setting up the stories now at the beginning to what I would assume to converge later on. I imagine whatever's going on with Edgar Nixon is going to merge with this inheritance letter from Nancy Drew, especially because we know Edgar Nixon stole the mail, and there is a good chance that if he opened all of the mail, he saw this letter. And he wants inheritance money. So if he can't get it from Ira, maybe he can get it from this other Mrs. Drew. Not to spoil the story, because I'm pretty sure it was also back here in the synopsis for what happens in the book. We don't have any nice line art in here, which is sad, but I know it can't be every chapter. So we also get another nice scene between her and her father. I think the scenes between her and her father are some of my favorite, just because their relationship is so wholesome. And he seems to really enjoy all of her love of mystery. And isn't that such a great thing for a parent to have? To actively be interested, or not even necessarily interested in the same things as their kids, but when they see their child or receive joy from something or be excited about something, they also experience joy and excitement from that. Parenting done right. Mr. Drew, the lawyer, who gets twinkling eyes when he says, then you wouldn't have the fun of a mystery to solve. He knows that she loves solving mysteries, and he's excited to present her with one. So then you get this new person. Once she goes home, George and Bess are there, and she gets to talk to them. And then this random lady is at the door trying to hit her, and that's where we end it. So, please let me know down in the comments your thoughts. What do you think of cliffhangers at the end of every chapter? Are they effective? Do they lose their effectiveness? Do you think that that can be done in a good way to keep the reader interested in turning the page? Like, is there an effective way, a more effective way to have cliffhangers at the end of every chapter? Maybe Nancy doesn't always escape harm from every cliffhanger. Maybe that's how so every time there's a cliffhanger, you actually don't know if Nancy is going to be harmed or not. It's a roulette wheel. And yeah, what do you think of the book so far? We're 4 chapters in now. We've got quite a bit of characterization of Nancy and her father. We're getting a little bit more of Edgar Nixon in the story. We've now name dropped Ned, who I don't think it's been stated is her boyfriend, but I imagine if you have read the books before this, you would know that Ned was her boyfriend. I do find it a little bit interesting that when she sees the photo of Edgar Nixon, she comments on how cold his eyes look and how he does sort of look like someone who shouldn't be trusted. Can you really tell that from a photo? Comment down below. And I feel like that's all I have to say on that chapter. If you like what I do here, if you want to continue this deep dive, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment. It all helps with the algorithm. You can subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so that you know every time I post. Deep dives for the Nancy Drew book and whatever book we decide to do after that is every Monday. Every Monday at 3 p.m. Poetry has now dropped to every other Thursday, but I'm hoping that I can do a bit more Roulette Friday videos. If you would like to know what else I do on the internet, please check out my Linktree. I have a Patreon. My lowest tier is $1.50 per month. And if you support me for at least $5, you get access to my Discord. I read more spicy stories over there, erotica on Wednesdays and smut on Saturdays. And I'm pretty sure that is all I have for this week in my shameless plug for my other content. And I will see you guys all next week for chapter 5. Bye! Thank you to everyone on my Patreon. Your support means so much to me, and I couldn't do this without you.